of our series of looking at our pastoral staff and the awesome things that you all do within the walls of the church as well as outside of the walls of the church. I think we're so blessed that we have a stellar staff, and I want to be able to share that information with the whole congregation and the world so that they will know what wonderful people we have here. So today I have the great opportunity to talk to Zac Cannon, and Zac is our Associate Pastor of Formation Fruitfulness that encompasses youth as well. So it is pretty well known here, Zac, that you ask a lot of great questions to stimulate thought, discussions. You're a big kid at heart. You love Star Wars, sci-fi, and you embrace being a bit nerdy. Those things are pretty true about you?
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to sit and talk to me today. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions and we'll just talk back and forth. So the first thing that I wanted to point out is that, in the past few months and weeks, we've talked a lot about being the thunder and being Jesus on the loose, if you will, as Barbara has put it, and using our gifts and talents. So I think it's pretty obvious here at Chestnut Grove how you use those things in your expressions of painting and the readings and preaching and the monologues like on Good Friday and what I consider all things digital and media during COVID, which was pretty neat. So those things are pretty obvious to us, but tell us what may be surprising about how these gifts and talents shape your everyday life.
I think, and you'll probably hear all the pastors allude to this somehow, but I think just being integrated, like I don't think of my life or my hobbies or what I do at home or what I do. I don't think of that as pieces compartmentalized. So who I am and how I express myself and how that looks in creativity or especially in spaces like this in church, it's all part of the whole. I want there to be integrity, and who you see is who you get in all the things that I do, and that's especially true in spaces like this. I want to be as true to myself as I can be so I can show up honestly, but also hopefully give permission to people to do the same thing.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to embracing and continuing to develop your talents.
Yeah, so I grew up in Southwest Virginia, same town as you and some of other folks in our church actually, and kind of grew up as I call myself non-judgmentally a trailer park kid. We were pretty poor and had to find creative ways to spend our time playing in the woods and riding bikes up and down the hill, and often that involved me writing out ridiculously detailed and long stories for the things we would play when we went outside that none of my friends actually ever wanted to do by the time I finished writing them. I actually found in some toys that my mom sent home a dog tag, and we had created this company and stamped these dog and so it was thorough. And so after high school, I was studying art at a community college and decided to look into going to film school because I've always enjoyed movies, both silly, dumb action movies and, more mature fare, and was able through the trajectory of my life and God providing ways to move my brand new wife and I to California in 2006, and I studied film there for 3 years. And I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts in film and video production, and the emphasis was on screenwriting because I prefer. I'm a bit of an introvert. People seem to think that I'm not because I can do things, but in front of a lot of people. Being in front of people, having a microphone doesn't scare me. I have no fear of public speaking. It's just being with people is harder for me. So I need more energy to recuperate afterwards. But I can do it. So studied film there for 3 years, finished that program, and dabbled a little bit in writing after that. But the significant change was about a year before we left to go to California is when I'd kind of found for the first time in my life as an adult Jesus and the church. And as much as I enjoyed nerding out on certain things, I found that I enjoyed nerding out on Jesus and theology and the Bible. And so about a year into being in California, we had been in a really awesome church that had kind of embraced us really early on in our journey. And I started working with youth as a volunteer. We had a smaller youth program. It was a smaller church. And so about halfway through our time there, it was kind of this crossroads of, do you continue one way and kind of lean into film and stories that way, or do you lean into the Jesus story and figure out how you use your life to tell that story? And I chose that. So while I was finishing up my film degree, I was also mentoring to become a youth leader, family director, all the titles that you have to give people that haven't gone through seminary yet in church, even though they're doing the same work. And started working with kids. I was probably only 22 or 23, and I thought I knew a lot. And I realize now that I know nothing, so I don't even know what that guy thought back in the day. So, all right, help me get back on track here. Where are we headed with this question?
To just go back a little bit, you said that you chose the Jesus story route versus the filmmaking, and it sounded like you felt like you had to make a choice.
Yeah, and for a long time, I that was part of my kind of Christian testimony, was that I had made a choice to put aside my little stories to tell, kind of the big story of Jesus, which is fair and is actually quite true. But I think over the years, I talked about being integrated when we started our conversation. There was a part of me that I was neglecting, and a part of my creativity that I was neglecting, because I didn't think those stories mattered as much, or were even worth telling, because they weren't, they weren't serving the kingdom. And it wasn't until COVID, when we had a little bit more mandatory free time, that I was able to carve out some time and to really work on something for the first time in probably 10 years. And also, some of that was, we had kids during that time, and that takes away all your energy and focus. And so I think our kids had gotten to a pretty good age, and we had some time. And so in 2020, I was able to sit down for the first time in a while. And I've written pieces here and there my whole life, but to really finish something for the first time in probably close to a decade. And that was a script called Sunflower. And it was really my way of processing the pandemic and kind of my anxieties and my worries. And, I was in the shower one day, where I do a lot of my great thinking. And I thought, what's the, if I was going to write a scary story that was real, what's the worst thing I could think of? And the worst thing I could think of was losing someone and not being able to do anything to stop that. Well, then how do you come to grips with that? And so that's what Sunflower, to me, is about. It's a story about loss and coming to grips with letting people go. And I ended up putting that in some film festivals and some screenplay competitions, and it did really well. It fared really well. And so then I decided to publish it as a little book. So
I hear that you wrote a book.
Yeah.
You're an author, if you will.
I'm a self-published author for the time being, but I have aspirations. We'll see what happens down the road.
So, I know I look back and kind of laughed at you when COVID hit and all of this media stuff, because I think God has a sense of humor. And it's kind of like, okay, so Zac chose this way, but God's like, no, you're going to do both. I'm going to show you can do both. That there's a place for both.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, because at the same time I was working on the script, I was dusting off all these old skills. And I remember I showed up with a camera, maybe the first week after lockdown, and we put together something simple. But then after week 3, I was like, hey, we can do more than this.
Yeah.
And I think when I turned in our first non-gathering video that was a little bit more creative, Lance was like, oh. And then of course Lance, when you give him tools, he gets creative. And so certain weeks I was like, you got to pump the brakes.
Yeah.
He had some ideas that were ambitious, but it was a really it was a fun time for our staff. I think it really brought us together in a way that we wouldn't have spent that much time together outside of that. And it helped us all I think some of the flexibility that we all learned during that time has carried over into how we continue to do church.
So tell me a little bit more about your book, your writing, what
Yeah.
you're working on now. I actually have a copy of the book if you want to see it, and if you want to know where to find it.
$8 on Amazon, you can, if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. So
I guess one of the big questions is, so why? I mean, you explained what what Sunflower is about to you, but so why did you do what you do?
yeah, and I love genres, and this is kind of a sci-fi apocalyptic thing, but that's because that's what the story needed for the human characters to experience what they did. And so I think when it comes to my writing, it's always ever about the humanness and the experience. And you can take a person and put them in all kinds of scenarios, as outlandish or weird as they may be, but at the core of it, it's connected to something that we're all ultimately experiencing. So like I said, with Sunflower, it's a story of a young husband whose fear is losing his wife. That's the whole story for me, despite all the oddities that occur during the story. And likewise, one thing I learned about myself, I shared at the Grove last year, was that I needed that hook for me to write. And so the new project I'm working on, so Sunflower is a novella, which is a fancier way of saying a really short book, because it's not long enough to be a novel, and it's really almost word for word just adaptation of the original script. My newest project is I'm working on a full-length novel, and the hook for that was my stepdad. And so about 6 years ago now, my stepdad passed unexpectedly, and I just decided I wanted to write a better ending for him. And so that's the hook for me for my newest project. And it's just as wild and kooky as Sunflower, but in a different way. But when I sit down to write, it's the relationship between the characters that kind of represent us, that's the anchor, and then all the silly fun stuff is the dressing. So.
I am not a sci-fi person, but I was determined I was going to read this book, and I loved it, even though I'm not a sci-fi person, because I think that humanity and stuff comes through your writing. And I was just going to share, this really reinforces what you think about weirdness and embracing it too. That weird is just weird until normal can catch up. We're all just behind the curve. And the trick is to realize it's always weird, and we're only ever chasing normal, which often means we're chasing something else. Crazy and weird are probably more common than whatever normal we daydream about. And I don't really consider myself to be a weird or a nerd person, but I was just thinking, gosh, if I were feeling abnormal or different, to read that would make a difference to me. I would feel that, hey, maybe all these other people that I think are normal are not the normal ones. I'm more normal than I think I am, sort of thing. So I can see where your writing speaks to, humanity and people in general. Because like I said, I am not a sci-fi person, but I really, really enjoyed this book. I got to the point that I didn't want to put it down until I finished it. So.
I guess that's a good that's what I aim for, so.
Okay, so switch topics here just a little bit, Zac. I know that you just graduated from a program it was a certificate program with a dual focus on spiritual direction and social transformation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I feel the spiritual direction aspect is still confusing to some folks, but it's simply, is a two-pronged program. And when it comes to spiritual direction, it was really tools to accompany people on their spiritual journey in a little bit more thorough way than even I was equipped to do in seminary. And it's really about, the core of it is deep listening and then encouraging people that what they're experiencing, what they're going through, the questions they're asking, the ups and downs of their life, the Spirit is at work, and the Spirit is always at work. So we listen, we encourage, and then we ask questions. And really, the program is less about someone coming to me as a pastor and saying, "Give me answers," and more me as a friend and someone else on this journey alongside them, saying, "Hey, let me help you listen to the Spirit yourself, and you can discover that God's talking to you." And sometimes that involves working through some of the things that are getting in the way of hearing the Spirit. And so that's also a tool that I have been developing. And then the social transformation aspect is looking at our world, looking at systems and institutions, and recognizing how they're built, how they function, and then being able to be critical of the way they function in the world that is contrary to the kingdom. And there's a lot of that. and even within the church, sometimes there's a need for, the other word for it is the prophetic tradition. The idea of being able to speak truth to a system and say, "Hey, I'm doing this same thing Jesus did." I don't think Jesus was critical of Judaism. Jesus wanted his people to be liberated from issues with the institution that was keeping them from perceiving what God was up to in the world. And so that's the social transformation aspect, is how can I have eyes to be able to look at the world and see it differently and then speak about that.
Did you stop it?
No, I think it's still going. I think the AirPods might have cut off, but I'll fix it.
So we've talked about a lot of things. Do you see a connection in all of these things? Is it all connected to kingdom building?
For me, it is. Again, it's hard for me to separate the personal from the communal aspect of it. So, I mean, she told me not to get too weird with this, but that's all we have, right? Like I can't leave my body, I can't leave my mind. I only have my experience and my life, and I'm comparing that to you and to everyone else, and hopefully we have some shared language and interests. But for me, it's about it's continuing to seek God's wholeness for me, which involves continuing to educate myself as a teacher and as a leader, continuing to humble myself by finding what spiritual practices resonate with me. The way I connect with God is different at 38 than it was at 23. And I think it's necessary to stay flexible. And then the other part is I believe that all of us, instead of, I think the whole carry your cross thing can be burdensome when we think we're supposed to squish everything about us and just be some blank, boring canvas, as opposed to say, well, the desires, the longings of my heart were put there by God. How can I use those to express God to the world? How can I be a unique reflection of the divine image that's in me by finding these outlets? And so here it's the same Zac that shows up for Good Friday is the same Zac that's sitting at my computer typing on Friday mornings, likely just as caffeinated. And what's coming out serves different purposes, but I think in the end, the freedom that comes from being able to express myself in both capacities helps me to know myself better, which helps me to know how God made me better. And I can show up with more confidence and authenticity.
And I can't help but think if we keep those gifts and talents that you said God has put in our heart, if we keep them within the walls of the church, it's kind of like hiding them under a bushel. I mean, we're not sharing them and using them to the fullest, and we're confining God to how he could work as well when we don't use those things.
My favorite compliment that I almost ever get from people at the gym or people that I occasionally do weddings for people that are not Christians, or, when I'm talking about books or stuff, is they say, like, you're the weirdest pastor I think I've ever known, because of how I spend some of my time and the things I like to talk about, and the music I like to listen to. But that to me is like open door. If we can continue to break down what people think, and invite people into our lives, then when I do talk about stuff that's really important to me about God and especially about Jesus, then I think that gives them an opportunity to see that I'm not pitching them something. It's part of who I am.
So in hindsight, do you see your move to ministry and even your move from place to place, from coast to coast and back, to be the end of one thing and the beginning of another each time, or just more of a continuation of what you're already doing?
I think both.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what life is a series of small deaths and rebirths into things. Whether that's you leave home for the first time, that life is kind of passing, and it's scary, and you grieve it. And I know that our seniors experience that every year when they leave for college, and parents experience that when they send their kids out the world. But then 2 years later, you had a whole different life, and it's all around, and same is true for me. So I grieved leaving California. We were there for 11 years. Not as much. I didn't grieve leaving Virginia the first time as much, but I definitely grieved leaving California. But it was more the relational stuff and the people and the food. But the adventure continues, and that's I sometimes go on walks, and when I feel really connected to God when I'm on these walks, I'm just overcome with thankfulness, because I'm aware of the beauty of the life that I've and the privilege of the life that I've been able to lead. And yeah, so it's all one thing, and it's all God. But there's deaths and rebirths and grief and learning and all that beautiful, messy life stuff along the way.
Well, thanks, Zach, for taking the time to share a little bit more about yourself, about things that we may not know about you. Help us get to know you better. Are there any final remarks or anything that you would like to say that you haven't had the opportunity to express?
I really like being here. And
really like having you here.
I appreciate it. And I look forward to a year from now when we can see how the story has continued to unfold.